Or do we want to just do bust into rigging? All right, rigging is delightful. So I'm going to go back to this monstrosity of a person that I've made. Yes. Back on this thing. All right, so I'm just going to go over like kind of a weird hodgepodge of rigging things that might be helpful. So one of the reasons that I really, really like rigging for modeling is because, especially for stuff like characters, like if you've ever seen like a D&D mini, none of them are just standing there in T-pose with like cloaks on and swords and like that would look ridiculous. So if you were to like make a 3D mini or something, you know, you'd want them posed. Efficiency-wise, it's way easier to model something, like basically model half a body in T-pose and have symmetry on. It saves you modeling time, and also, I tried to make a character in a pose once, and I tried to just model it in that pose, and one of the arms was like 2 feet longer than the other one. It was horrifying. And I submitted that to a co-op, and then I looked back in shame. And I'm like, I hate everything. And I'm like, holy crap, rigging would have fixed all of those issues. So anywho, so mostly I just like it because I can model with symmetry, and it guarantees my arms are the same length. So just like off the bat, the first thing you're going to do if you want to switch into rigging is go out of your modeling menu and into your rigging menu. Basically all rigging is creating a series of, imagine like bones for your character that are going to drive how it moves and like control how it moves. So first thing to do is actually create some joints. If I click on this little skeleton menu up here and just do create joints. For the most part, it does pretty much whatever you need for the settings. The only thing that sometimes I'll play with is this short bone radius here. Because like if I add in the joints, sometimes, let me actually, if I set this up to something really obnoxious like 1, this is like a horrible scale. Like if I look at this and, okay, that's a bad example. Hang on, sorry. Image planes away. All right. All right, so if I look at these joints like in comparison to the character, sometimes they end up being like super huge and just like hard to look at, or like so small you can barely see them. That's all the short bone radius is. It's just adjusting the size of those bones, which is not a functional thing, purely just like an aesthetic ease of use thing, but that's really the only setting that I ever worry about in that particular menu. So first thing, when you create joints, by default it'll put them on whatever grid you are working on. So if I draw them in perspective mode, it's just going to dump them straight on at like 0 on the Y-plane. If I draw them in, you know, one of my side modes like this, it's going to draw them straight on either my X or my Z plane. You can then, of course, once they're created, you can move them wherever you want. But that's just by default how they're created. So you'll notice, like, so once I'm gonna hide this monstrosity of a body because it is creeping me out. All right. Oh, an eyeball. All right. Cool. So by default, when you make joints, you'll notice that this is what their little icon thing looks like. It's pretty much just like a little purple, I don't really know how to describe that. Kind of looks like an elbow. Purple elbow. If I expand this, you can see that it's just like all my joints here. And if you guys ever have like a lot of stuff nested in your outliner like this, if you press and hold shift and then hit the plus key, it'll expand your entire hierarchy at once. So like again, if I hold down shift, it'll be like boop and just pop all of the stuff out. Kind of good sometimes, kind of annoying others, but again, if you need it, it's there. So basically the way that these joints work, it's the same way as parenting works with, so if you guys happen to play with ShaderBot, I pretty much just attached all of his body parts together with semi-clever parenting, I guess, and that's like how you controlled his movement. So if I move joint 1, it's going to move all of the other joints with it. Same thing, like if I, grab joint 5, it's going to take joint 6, 7, 8, 9 with it. Pretty much anything that's under the joint in the outliner is going to follow that joint whenever you move it. So you can think of it kind of like shoulders, where like if I move my shoulder, it hopefully takes my elbow and hand with it. If it doesn't, you should probably see someone about that. But that's basically how joints work. It is literally just parenting. So if I like took joint 5 and I'm just middle mouse button dragging this pretty much anywhere not under joint 1, you can see that it's actually gone and straight up disconnected the joint from this original chain. So if I'll take joint 1 and I will move this around, and you can see that like joint 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 no longer follow that joint. If I move 5, the rest of the stuff still follows it. So any questions about that so far? All right. If I happen to want to, and if I like took joint 5 and then move that under, say, joint 2, you'll notice now that instead of being perfectly nested, where I had joint 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like just keep going down in a perfect diagonal, joint 5 is at the same level as joint 3. So in this case, it's actually connected. Here's joint 1, here's joint 2, joint 3, and joint 5. So it's actually like connected them basically both to joint 2. So if I move joint 2, it takes both of them with it. Move joint 1, still takes all of them, etc. This is more or less just like how you arrange stuff in the outliner depends how things attach together and how they move in the end. So that's like honestly pretty much most of what you need to know about joints. The only other thing that I really have to say about these is they are defined, the length of these bones is defined by some like fun geometry. Honestly, it pretty much is just geometry, but it's like the distance between point A and point B. And that point A and point B, like the coordinates of that, are just the translate values of that bone itself. So in this case, like you can see, kind of like based on the different, like these all have different translate values. So if I change this, like if I move this around, for one, it's getting different translate values, obviously, but it's also physically shortening that bone. So normally once you put them in place, you just sort of leave them there, or like you don't fiddle with the translate of them. Once you position them properly, leave the translate alone, because then it'll basically unposition them. And there's no way to really go back to what it was before. So like I can't go through and like I can't freeze transformations on a joint. It literally won't let me do it. If I zero out my joints like I normally would to snap something back to the origin, in this case it snaps it onto the joint right above it in the chain, because that's pretty much 0, 0 for that joint. It goes off local space. So any of the translate values you see on joint 3 are based pretty much on the distance from joint 2, if that makes sense. Honestly, not super terribly important. Mostly just like don't fiddle with the translate values unless you want to permanently move your joints. Rotate values, strictly speaking, if you are animating on your joints, don't animate on your joints. Actually, just don't do that. But if you are just doing like a quickie model and you're literally just using this to repose a model, you don't care if it gets a little animated, a little broken, you can totally rotate these, and those at least you can zero back out, and that won't hurt anything. But the rotation values actually drive, so you can kind of see like this behaves as like a little bit of like a funky arm where you can be like, hey, hello. And it is mostly the rotate values that sort of you end up using in the end anyway. So the fact that you can't use translate doesn't really hurt you in the long run for using these for models. Any questions on just like basic joint stuff before I get rid of this weird spiky thing? All right. So in terms of actually rigging a person, I am not going to go through like the hardcore, like how to actually rig a person. A, I don't have time right now, and B, you really don't need to know exactly how. I do have a video of it on my YouTube linked somewhere. If you guys are interested in checking that out, you're welcome to. But I'll pretty much just show you guys how to do legs today. So, first thing I'm going to do, skeleton, create joints. I'm just gonna dump somewhere maybe like in the center-ish of the pelvis. I'm just gonna throw a joint in, and I'm gonna hit enter. So this is my joint 1. I'm gonna actually duplicate this twice. So right now I have 3 different joints in the exact same place. I'm gonna call the first one root, the second one spine 1, close enough, and the other one pelvis. So I'm gonna take spine 1 and pelvis and put them under root. So now if I move the root joint, it's going to take the spine and the pelvis with it. But the spine and pelvis will also rotate independently. So this is just like, again, not super important right now. If you want to like fiddle with rigging a human character, just make sure that you do have that root, and that any leg stuff is going to go under pelvis, any upper body stuff is going to go under spine. Basically, it just allows you a little bit of extra control in the pelvis area for your character. The next thing I'm going to do is actually throw in some joints for the legs. So I'm going to start somewhere kind of maybe like in the center of where I imagine a hip joint would be. So I'll just like click there, go down to my knee, and usually for like knees and stuff like that, for any joints with 3 loops, I'll try to get as close to that center loop as possible and a little bit forward. So I'll put that slightly going forward on the knee, if you can see that. And then I'll throw another joint on the ankle and on the ball of the foot, even though I have no loops there. So now I have this like really awkward looking little leg joint chain. If you go into your perspective view, you will notice that it is just sort of hovering awkwardly between the legs, and you're like, this is not where my leg is. So I'm just going to go over and drag that casually into his actual leg. At this point, I'm also going to go through and just relabel things. So for stuff like legs, it's good to label your joints like left or right. So I'm just going to call this left hip. I don't care. Left ankle, whole ball. All right. So I don't really care how you choose to define left and right if you guys are doing your own rigging stuff. I personally do it based off of the character's left and right because I just think it's fairly unambiguous, and I don't know, that's just sort of how I do things. But again, it really doesn't matter. The actual name has no bearing on how the rig will behave. So right now I have my super nice rig. So 2 quick things. One thing you can do, like I hate working on rigging and wireframe at the same time because the rig is pretty much wireframe by default, and I just think it's messy to look at. So if you want to look at your model normally like this, if you go to, like up in your little viewport menu right here, like where you'd go to import an image plane, if you go to shading and X-ray joints, turn that on, you'll be able to see the joints through your mesh, which again, I am very much a fan of. I just think it makes things way easier to look at. The other thing that you should do, or you can do if you want, is set up display layers for your rig. So in this case, like a lot of times I want to be able to see the skin of the person, but not mess with it, not select it. So if I just go down here, again, in my channel box, I showed you guys last week, I think. Did I show you guys this last week? I think I did. All right. If I didn't, really quick, so this is the channel box. If you look down below, you'll see it's like display tab. Basically, it just allows you to make kind of like layers in Photoshop. So this little button here will just straight up create a new layer. The little white plane with a circle is going to make a new layer with whatever objects you have selected. So if I click that, you can see it jumps in this little layer. And then if I toggle the visibility of this layer on and off, it's actually toggling my skin on and off because my skin is in that layer. So in this case, I'm just going to double click this and call it flesh. That was creepy. I don't know why I called it flesh. Anyway, so I can use this basically, again, so visibility is just going to toggle it on and off. This little button, or like this by default empty box, if I hit it once, it's going to set it to T template mode. It allows me to select this, I can see the wireframe of the mesh, but it's grayed out and I can't select it. If I click on that one more time, it's going to set it to R or reference mode, where I can't select my object, but I can still see it there. So a lot of times I'll do this for rigging, because like I want to see my mesh so I know where to put the joints. I just don't need to click on it every 2 seconds. So just like saves me accidentally clicking on the thing. So I just like, again, set that to a display layer, set it to reference. So what I'm going to do now is take my hip and put that under my pelvis, because that is actually where your hip is connected on an actual skeleton, I would hope. So now we have a glorious leg chain here. So Maya actually has like a honestly super lovely way to mirror over leg chains, or just like parts of your skeleton. So if you go to skeleton mirror joints, and this one you are going to want to open up the settings for. So mirror function I usually just leave alone. Mirror across is just which axis you want to mirror it across, and honestly I can literally never remember which one I'm supposed to be doing, so I'll just be like, oop, nope, not what I wanted. And actually just delete that joint chain. Okay, let me try YZ, and I'm like, okay, cool, that's the one that I actually wanted. There's now 2 legs that are actually in the legs. The other thing that you can do, which is like super fun, is search for and replace with. So this is going to look through the name of your the names of your joints. If it finds whatever string of characters you type in here, it's going to replace it with whatever string of characters you type in here. Pretty much exactly like find and replace in Microsoft Word, it's doing that in Maya. But in this case, so I'm taking the left leg and I'm turning it into the right leg. And I'd love to not have to go through and be like right leg, like right hip, right knee, right, and like rename everything. So if I just type in L underscore and right underscore, because that's how I personally denote right and left, I'll just, you know, put L or R and then underscore. So if I hit apply, you'll notice that not only do I have another perfect duplicate of this leg chain here, but it's actually gone through and it has relabeled everything, so it's like all the right side of the knee, or the leg. So that's a super handy, lovely, delightful feature of Joy. It does get really nice if you do have, like, if you're doing like tentacle arms, you have like 30 joints in each thing or whatever, and then you're like, I don't want to rename those manually. But yeah, so that's more or less how you would set up a like basic, you know, joint chain for the leg. If you wanted to throw in some spine joints, you just kind of be like, aha. So the thing with spines, they bend and then they hit your rib cage and then they don't bend as much. So a lot of times when you're just doing like a rig skeleton or whatever, you'll put a few joints for the curvature of the bottom of the spine, and then once you hit the rib cage, you just put like one giant joint that goes up to wherever your neck starts, and then you might have however many joints that you want in the neck, and then be like, cool, that's pretty much my joint chain for my spine. So let's go ahead and call this spine 2, spine 2, spine 3, spine 4. Oh wait, I do that every time. So spine 4 is actually just, I usually name that chest, because it is the chest joint, and then I'll just call this like neck, and head. So, and it is, I'll get to a minute why it's like actually nice to like relabel your joints, because I'm going to show you again. If you don't label them, it does get kind of confusing. So I'm just going to take spine 2 and put that under spine 1. And now I have basically a functional little mini skeleton. So at this point, like what I can do, I can take my root if I needed to like move my entire character up and down. But I also have individual control of the pelvis if you need to make your guy do a weird jig, or like the spine. So that's like kind of why I set it up like that to begin with. More important if you're doing like fancy actual rigging stuff. But yeah. So once you have your joint spine or your joints in, you're like, cool, I want to move the leg and like have this guy do a fantastic air kick, but it's not actually moving his body. So what you need to do is basically, it's called skin binding, but you need to take the model of the character and attach it to your skeleton. So I'm going to select the character, select and shift select the root joint, and then go up to skin and bind skin. And this is another one where I usually do open up the settings, partly because I fart around with them a lot and usually set them to stuff that's weird. But basically all skin binding is it's just saying, for each vertex on the model, it's saying you're going to follow the knee for like 80% of your movement and the pelvis for like 20% of your movement. It's basically just saying how much each vertice follows a particular joint, and that's how you control pretty much how the character bends and deforms and moves. So in this case, I usually just ignore most of these settings, like bind method, skinning method, normalized weights, weight distribution. If my bind is like really, really gross, I might go in and just sort of like play with them and see. It's just like different mathematical ways of like how they calculate things. For the most part, I kind of just ignore them. What I do pay attention to is the bind to. So joint hierarchy is going to collect, if I have one joint like anywhere in this joint chain selected, it's going to bind this skin to all of the joints in that chain. So in this case, again, I can just select root and be like, cool, I'm just going to attach you, I'm going to bind the skin to the root, and it's going to bind it to all of the joints that I've just made, which in this case does actually make sense. There's also bind to selected joints, which a lot of times I will do for like an eyeball, where like I don't really want, if I bend my neck, the eyeball should not change shape. So that's where I would usually just, grab the eyeball itself and be like selected joints, right eye, bind to right joint, and then it just only moves with the eyeball joint. But again, in this case, I want joint hierarchy. And then the max influences is, and you can change this later, I usually just set it to 3, but it's basically how many of these little bones that you've made are going to influence a specific vertex. So I just think 3 is like a nice manageable number to work with, and it kind of makes sense with like most of the humanoid rigging and stuff that I do. Again, you can fiddle with this later. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply, and you can see that now as I move my leg, it rips his leg apart, but it's at least moving his skin now, question mark? So the way that you normally would fix many of the horrible, horrible things that happen by default rigging is like, so you'll notice if I go like this and be like, aha, if I break his leg aggressively. Torturing your rigged characters is super fun, just for the record. But anywho, so like obviously I don't want the left leg attached to the right leg, because that makes literally no sense at all. So the easiest way to fix this, and I'm just going to go through really quick and put my joints in another thing, another display layer, call it skeleton, and I'll just set those to reference. Because again, I don't really need to click on these right now, I just kind of want them to exist as they are. So again, I want to be able to actually control how the vertices are attached to the joints, because this makes no sense. So I'm going to click on my mesh, right click, and you'll see that now it's a skin. It has the option for the paint skin weights tool. So if you open that, it's going to pull up this. By default, it's going to be grayed out here. But basically, this is showing you a visual representation of like, here are all the joints that have influence on the skin. If I click on a particular joint, it's showing me where basically a color value for like how much weight is on a given vertex for that joint. Basically how attached a vertex is to the joint that you've selected, if that makes sense. Personally, I like turning, if you go under here, under gradient, I like color ramp because I think it's way easier to visually see. So like white is going to be, that vertice follows the joint completely. And then red, as you get to cooler colors like blue, that's just sort of like blue is almost no influence, red is like a lot of influence. Pretty much just like a little heat map value thing. So in this case, I'm looking at the left knee, and I'm like, why the actual heck is the right knee attached to part of my right leg? Legs, it'll do this a lot in Maya, and also fingers, just by default. There's like no great way to get around it. But basically what I can do is go in through this menu and just sort of paint the skin weights to be something different so that the mesh deforms better. So in this case, you have your little settings for like paint operation. Normally I only use replace or smooth. I've never really found a great use for add or scale. So again, most times I just use replace or smooth. And then profile is pretty much just your brush profile. So this guy is, you know, solid, 100% hardness brush, kind of in Photoshop, no fall off, no fuzzy edges. This one is like super fuzzy edged. And again, this one is a square if you need a square. You can also import your own images if you, for some reason, I have no idea why you need to do that, but you can. So again, I don't really care which one of these you use, as long as it gets you the results that you need. And then the only other things that I really look at down here, so opacity is opacity. It pretty much functions like opacity in Photoshop. And then the value is basically the weight that you're painting on. So in this case, I would like to get rid of the weight on this leg from my left knee, because it's weird, doesn't quite make a lot of sense. So I'm just going to set my brush to be super hard and set my value or my weight to 0, because I don't want it to follow that joint, and set opacity to 1. And I'm just going to doodle all over my mesh. I might also, if you go under stroke, you can change the stroke size. So what if I set this to like 4? And it's like, ha ha ha. And you can see this doesn't inherently look better off the bat, but once I go through and, like, you know, remove the ankle influence, you can see that the foot shape for at least this is starting to normalize a little bit. So I can go back in and, again, just sort of do that, hello, like do that with the hip, so it doesn't quite follow the other leg so much, and you just kind of keep doing this until it does what you want. It's honestly not like a super interesting process. So in this case, I'm going to take my right hip and just sort of do the same thing. I'll paint off the values for my left leg, so that hopefully at this point my left leg would snap up a little bit and be kind of more where I wanted and or expected. I'll do the right knee, and you can see, yeah, so like once I start doing that, the bend in the leg actually starts looking pretty decent. So yeah, and I mean you can see like even, cool. So I'm just kind of like, you know, going doing stuff. It is the knee joint, weird. And sometimes you kind of got to go back and forth and just be like, no, and really crush out some of those values. But you can see, like, once you've done that, you have a pretty reasonable, kind of funky, it's not the best, but you can see that you have a nice little leg that can sort of deform. And if I wanted to, it's like, I think this, the way that this bending is like a little bit bizarre. So I'm just going to set my skeleton to reference again, go back into my paint skin weights tools, which I stashed somewhere. Hey, all right. So in this case, usually if I'm painting on weights for a specific joint, I just tend to prefer to switch to a softer brush, and I'll still go with replace. So in this case, I'm looking at this, I'm like, maybe the bottom of the leg feels like it's deforming kind of too much. So I'll go into my left knee joint, and I might try actually smoothing. So I feel like maybe it's go in and kind of like smooth this out a little bit. Basically what smoothing does is it does some kind of mathematical operation to sort of normalize those vertices. So if you had one area that was like really harsh, like a straight line of like pure influence of white, you could sort of click over that and it would help sort of spread that out along the other joints and make a little bit of a softer transition. So sometimes I'll use that for areas like this. In this case, I think I might actually want to go in and potentially replace some of the influence here with something a little bit more influence on the knee. So I'm going to set my value back to 1 and my opacity down to 0, or down lower. And again, how you do this doesn't really matter. This is just like how I personally like working on things. And you can just sort of go in and like paint that to be whatever you need. But that's like pretty much honestly like how you would use a rig to pose stuff. Are there any questions on anything I just showed you guys? All right. This is like by no means the most rigging you can do, but you can, if you want, you know, make your character do this. I don't know why you would want to do this, but, or you could be like, I would like to propose to a random mystery person. I don't know. Any questions on anything else we went over today? All right, in that case, be free. If you guys are interested, I'll find a picture of that creepy mask I did and show you guys. But you guys are welcome to wander out. Yes?